Forward to cloud if possible.
Okay.
Perfect. Thank you.
Okay, great. Okay. So there's a lot of interest in what makes local economies resilient to adverse economic shocks, and a lot of attention has been placed on the role of universities. So as one example, Pittsburgh's well-known universities are often credited with the city's resilience to Rust Belt decline. So we use a new empirical strategy to identify the effects of universities on local economic resilience. We use the placement of normal schools to train teachers and insane asylums by state legislatures in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. We argue and show that the criteria for where to locate these two very different types of institutions was remarkably similar. So normal schools eventually converted to regional public universities, and they grew substantially in size. Asylums mainly still continue as state-owned psychiatric institutions, and they've stayed roughly the same size. And so this setting allows us to compare counties that effectively randomly received universities because they effectively randomly got a normal school instead of an insane asylum in the mid-1800s or early 1900s. We are going to look at the effects of universities on resilience to manufacturing decline, and we find that universities provide nearly full resilience. So every job that's lost due to manufacturing exposure in asylum counties is not lost in normal counties. We then look at the mechanisms that might explain this resilience, and we see that much of the resilience can be explained by the resilience of university spending. We also see that universities have a causal effect on the share of the local population with a bachelor's degree. And our results are consistent with this increase in bachelor's share also explaining a modest to substantial share of the resilience. So I want to highlight two things that I'm not going to get to today in the talk, but are in the paper, so I encourage you to take a look at the paper if you're interested. We also show resilience, that universities increase resilience to business cycle shocks, as well as to the oil and coal shocks of the 1980s. During the middle of the 19th century, there was strong support for public institutions that were aimed at social reform or social improvement. And those included normal schools to train teachers. So in the mid-1800s, there was growing demand for elementary and secondary school teachers as local communities began to operate their own elementary and secondary schools. And much of that demand for trained teachers was met through states establishing normal schools to train teachers in the norms of good teaching, hence the name normal. 210 normal schools were opened between 1839 and 1930. And states often established multiple of these schools across their state. The schools were established through legislation. Their locations were chosen either directly by the legislature or through commissions that were established by the legislature. Fortuitously enough for us, there was a book written in 1923 on the factors that determined the locations of state normal schools. And the main argument in that book is that the most important factor was political influence, which is not surprising given the process through which these normal schools were determined where they would be located. But other factors included demand for instruction, for example, population, geographic accessibility to other parts of the state, as well as the natural beauty of the location. These normal schools were highly desired by their local communities. So this beautiful piece of painted fabric was made by the people of DeKalb, Illinois, to celebrate DeKalb being chosen as the location for the new normal school in the state of Illinois. By the 1900s, many of these normal schools had been converted to teachers' colleges, which allowed them to award a bachelor's degree. By the 1950s, many had become state colleges, so teacher was completely removed from the name of the institution. And by the 1970s, many had been converted to regional public universities. So when you think of these universities, you shouldn't be thinking of research-intensive universities. None of these are Research 1 universities based on the Carnegie ratings, and only 2% of them were Research 2 universities. Almost all of them are universities that focus on education through the master's degree, or otherwise known as comprehensive universities. So in the state of Illinois, Eastern Illinois University is an example of a public university that started as a normal school and became one of these regional public universities. But I think it's important to note that we're not identifying the effect of a major research university or a flagship state school on economic development or resilience, which has been the focus of much of the literature on the impact of universities on local economies. But we think these regional universities are really policy relevant. So for firstly, in 1980, which is roughly the starting point of our analysis, these universities awarded 42% of all bachelor's degrees in the United States. There's also a lot of discussion about closing these universities, consolidating these universities, merging these universities, as well as about their sustainability and their future. They're also much more dependent on state funding, and so they're annually policy relevant. One of the justifications for funding these universities is often their role as anchor institutions in economic development in their local market. So we're happy to contribute with causal estimates on at least one side of these trade-offs in this policy discussion. But I think it's reasonable to think that regional universities affect resilience in ways that are different than research universities would. So during this period of social reform, there was also a movement to reform and build new insane asylums. And the goal of these insane asylums was to cure patients and to restore them rather than just to house these patients. And the locations of these new insane asylums were also typically assigned by legislatures, and sometimes at the very same time that the legislatures were considering where to put these normal schools. So this 1923 book on normal school locations references specific examples of legislatures that were deciding on the locations for normal schools and insane asylums at the same time, and referencing all the political negotiations and deals that were going on in the legislature to determine which district would get the normal school and which district would get the asylum. So we think that's helpful for us because it raises the plausibility of it being effectively random whether a county got a normal school or got an asylum in this time period. So political influence was one of the main criteria for where these would be located, but other factors were being close to population centers, close to roads and railroads, as well as in picturesque locations. So very similar factors as the normal schools. The asylums were also very highly desired by their local communities. So this is a newspaper article from the Kankakee Gazette in Kankakee, Illinois, from 1877, when Kankakee was awarded the new insane asylum. So the headline says, "Got it, knew we would, couldn't be otherwise." And the article goes on to describe celebrations that occurred with bonfires and music and speeches, and it went on to thank the representatives in the state legislature for their help in locating the insane asylum in Kankakee. So I'll talk in a minute about the deinstitutionalization movement in the United States, but many of these, the properties on which these asylums are located continue as state-owned psychiatric institutions. Some of them have been converted to correctional facilities, and a few have been acquired by universities. So before getting into econometric evidence of balance, I thought I'd ask you to try to guess which of these pictures is an insane asylum and which is a normal school. So I'll give you a second. It's not an easy task. I'm always happy that I have the next slide with the answers because I'm sure I would forget. But for those of you who did give it a try, the black and white pictures are the normal schools and the color photos are the asylums. So you can see visually, these institutions look quite similar. They have this ornate, important architecture. They're on these manicured, landscaped grounds that are like campuses. And so we also think this is supportive of these being similar institutions that might have been similarly desired and required similar political influence. So there are 2 points I want to make from this plot. The first is if you look in the 1920s to 1940s, the size of these institutions was roughly the same in this period. So the blue open diamonds are the institutionalized population in mental hospitals in the asylum counties. And you can see that it ranges between 2.5% and 5% of the county's population. And the solid blue circles are the enrollment in the colleges that had previously been these normal schools in the normal counties. And you can see that during this time period, they're also around 2.5%. So we, again, think this is helpful in that these institutions were similarly sized and might have required similar influence to locate them there. The second point is this divergence that happens in the 1960s. So while they were similarly sized in the early 1900s, the normal schools converted to colleges and universities, and they became much larger relative to the county population. So enrollment reached 10% of county population by 1970, whereas you can see this deinstitutionalization movement in the United States as the asylums sort of declined. We see this decline in the Blue Diamonds, but as I mentioned, those asylums were converted to other types of psychiatric institutions or correctional facilities. So if you look at the total institutionalized population per county population, it's still roughly similar in these asylum counties. And so this is what we're really interested in, is that some of these counties got this institution that ended up being quite large relative to what it had originally been intended as. So we obtained data on normal school locations from a book on normal schools by Ogden. And we also digitized data on asylums from the 1923 special census of institutions of mental disease. There are some counties that were assigned both a normal school and an asylum. We also think that's supportive that the criteria for where to locate these institutions was similar, given that the same county ended up with both. In our main analysis, we classify these as normal counties since they did have these normal schools, but we also dropped them for robustness. And in the end, we're left with about 200 counties that had these normal schools and 126 asylum counties. So the main thing I want you to focus on in this graph is that if you look within any given state, you'll see that the state has several asylums and several normal schools distributed across the state. And so most of our analysis is going to be looking within states at differences between the normal schools and the asylum counties. So one of the main issues that confronts the literature on the role of universities in economic development is that we think that universities are probably not randomly located. And so here we show that's true for these normal schools. If you look at the fifth column, we're comparing the normal counties to all other counties in the state. And you can see that the counties that got the normal schools were larger in population, they had more manufacturing, and they were more urban relative to all other counties in the state, suggesting the need for a control group or counterfactual for what would have happened if these universities had not been established. And you can see that the asylums are one good counterfactual group in that all of these differences are no longer statistically significant. These are characteristics in 1840. So this is before the normal schools were established and before most of the asylums were established as well. We also showed the results in 1920 when we have the full sample of states. So how did the normal schools affect the local economy by the time they had been converted to universities? The main effect is that it added a regional public university in the community, as our history suggests, but otherwise there are small effects. So if you look at just the first row here, you can see that 91% of our normal counties have a regional college that was formerly a normal school. So this means that there were several normal counties whose normal school never converted to a public college or university. The normal school was just closed before that happened. Our main specification is going to be a reduced form looking at the impact of having been assigned a normal school. And so we might be underestimating this effect of having a university since some of our normal counties never get universities. We present an IV specification to address that issue. The second thing I want to point out here is that if you look at the total number of colleges, so you add up the coefficients on the public 4-year, the private 4-year, and the 2-year colleges, you can see the total number of colleges is actually roughly similar between these two types of counties. The difference is that these normal counties were much more likely to get a public university, and that public university was much larger relative to the population. So you can see that in terms of enrollment, as well as in terms of total degrees awarded as a percent of the population. But then we look at the effect of these universities on the economy in 1980, by which time many of these normal schools have been converted to universities. So we look at the effect in levels, as well as in growth between 1950 and 1980, which is the period when most of these conversions to universities happened. And we see surprisingly little effect on population or employment. In terms of median family income, there's some evidence that median family income might be slightly lower in the counties that had these normal schools. There could be a couple of reasons for that. It could be that we're picking up students and student income. It could be that there's a slight difference in composition of the economy by that time, in that these economies are slightly less concentrated in manufacturing and more in retail, and that might have had implications for wages. So why do we think these normal schools or these universities didn't affect the level of economic development in 1980? Well, the 1950s and through 1980 was a period of general economic growth in the US, and these are positively selected counties, and so they're both doing relatively well. The rest of the paper looks at the role of universities in providing resilience to adverse economic shocks. And we're going to focus on two episodes of resilience to manufacturing decline. The first is the Rust Belt manufacturing declines, which started in the late 1970s and early 1980s. And the second were the accelerated declines in manufacturing that started in the 2000s. And so our main specification is relatively simple. Our dependent variable is just long-run employment growth or population growth. Beta 2 is going to tell us the impact of increasing manufacturing exposure on long-run employment growth in asylum counties. And beta 3 is going to tell us that differential effect of manufacturing exposure in normal counties. And so we're interested in whether this beta 3 is less than 0, or whether the negative effect of manufacturing exposure is less negative in normal counties. Sorry, is greater than 0. So before we get to that specification, I'm going to show you the results from a similar specification, which is an event study type design, in which I'm showing the coefficients on the triple interaction between year, the indicator for normal school, and manufacturing share in 1978. And you can see that increasing manufacturing share in 1978 has a differentially positive or less negative effect on employment in the normal counties relative to the asylum counties. And we see that happens precisely at the time of the beginning of the Rust Belt manufacturing declines. Reassuringly, we don't see a pre-existing trend in this relationship, which suggests that we're not just capturing some persistent differences between these normal and asylum counties by manufacturing exposure. So these are the results from the main regression specification I showed you. If you look at column 3 here, you can see that if you increase the manufacturing share in 1978 by 10 percentage points, that employment growth in asylum counties falls by 24 percentage points. But that decrease is less negative in the normal counties, such that the total effect of increasing manufacturing share is close to 0 in those counties. We see something similar with population growth, also with earnings per job, as well as per capita transfers. We think that's interesting because it suggests that government investment in education might reduce the need for spending in other areas, for example, on transfer programs. We do some initial investigations into this area in the paper. This is the plot for the whole country. Here you can see that if you increase manufacturing share in 2000, there's a differentially less negative effect on employment in normal counties relative to asylum counties, again, starting right around the time of these accelerated declines of the 2000s. And again, in column 3 here, you see that if you increase the 2000 manufacturing share by 10 percentage points, that employment growth in asylum counties falls by 12 percentage points, but that drop is less negative in the normal counties.
Russ, just to highlight, you're at 19 minutes.
Okay, yep, I'm finishing up.
Okay,
great, thanks. And we see something similar for population growth. So just in the last minute, I'm going to talk briefly about our work into looking at the mechanisms. So we focus on 2 groups of mechanisms. The first is that university spending is more resilient in normal counties, and that could be because public university spending is more resilient, or because student demand at public universities is more resilient. This might have a direct effect as well as a multiplier effect. Similarly, universities increase the local bachelor's degree share, and this might decrease the negative effect of exposure. For example, college-educated individuals might more easily shift away from sectors that are in persistent decline. So this is a hypothesis that has been tested in several papers, including a paper by Bruce, as well as several others. So just briefly, we find that university spending is more resilient in normal counties, that this direct effect can account for about 15% of the total resilience. Once we put a typical multiplier on that and adjust for the fact that we don't capture construction spending by universities, we argue that it might be closer to 40%. We see resilience of employment across many non-tradable sectors, and we think this is extra support for there being a multiplier effect. We don't see that the manufacturing sector is more resilient in normal counties, which is an important result. And second, we do see that universities have a causal impact on the share of the population with a bachelor's degree, and the results are consistent with this explaining a modest to substantial portion of the resilience as well. So just to wrap up, we do see that regional universities make counties more resilient using a new identification strategy that uses the placement of normal schools and insane asylums by legislatures in the mid-1800s or early 1900s. We see that university spending is an important mechanism and results that are consistent with the baseline education levels being a mechanism as well. Policy proposals often cite economic development as one reason to support universities, and so we're happy to contribute here with causal estimates that quantify one side of these trade-offs. Thanks very much.
Terrific. So now Bruce Sacerdote will discuss. Bruce, are you able to share your screen?
Let's find out. Yeah, it looks like I can.
Thanks for
Let
sharing.
me see if I can find now the screen I want to share. Thanks very much, David. I assume you can all see the screen. Awesome. Thanks very much, Russ, Greg, and Yuhao for a great paper. I mean, this is very fun. You wouldn't know it because I haven't worked on this topic for a long time, but this is a real interest of mine. This idea that universities do something sort of beyond collecting rents and that they have real impacts, real local economic impacts, and this is some I think super nice evidence that that's the case. I have a few. And by the way, the paper is forthcoming in Restat, and deservedly so. Russ assured me that I wouldn't be able to do too much damage to the paper because it's already been accepted. I have a few thoughts for the authors. Of course, first I'd like to be able to change slides, which I don't seem to be able to do on my computer. Let me try this. Oh my God, there we go. Okay, so as I mentioned, it's a nice paper on regional public colleges or sort of regional universities and how that buffers local economic shocks. As I already mentioned, there's a lot of reasons to like this paper, and it's something that I think a lot of us just are inherently interested in, partly because we work in the sector and partly because we care about local labor markets. And so I think it's some of the best evidence out there on this. It's also a very nice piece of economic history because we have these institutions that get put in place more than 100 years ago. And the vast majority of them are not only still around, they've gotten bigger over time. And they're having effects that the founders never thought they would. Luckily for me, I'll show you a slide that Russ was about to show you when he ran out of time. If you look at the year, this graph on the left is the distribution of years in which the normal schools open and the asylum schools open, and that's happening very much in the same time frame. And then there's this period of conversion to regional colleges and regional universities. And the important point, so as Russ showed you, they look quite similar. But then around the starting in the 50s, all of a sudden the schools become a lot bigger and serve a different function. Main results in 15 seconds. It seems like they fully offset shocks. It's surprising. We know these shocks are big. It's almost surprising that they appear to fully offset. Like this is think about a 10% shock. A 10% initial share of manufacturing has a very large, a 20% negative effect on employment. The change in employment 78 to 2018, but that seems to be fully offset by the presence of a normal school, which turns into typically a regional college. So it blunts all the shock, really. Maybe it's a little bit harder to talk about the mechanisms with certainty, but maybe part of it works through university spending growth. And that's what I want to talk about next. So this is the column 1 shows you this idea that university spending growth is if we go again with a 10% higher manufacturing share in 78, you'll have a 5% larger university spending growth. That's what I want to focus on. But also I want to contrast that to the fact that university spending growth is higher in general in areas with normal schools. So there's level effects too. And so what I'd love to see or maybe hear more from Russ and his co-authors later today is about the levels versus the resilience, the response to the manufacturing share versus just the positive level effects that these places may have. And it seemed like the graphs are showing you that there aren't necessarily big level effects prior to 1980, but maybe there are big level effects now beyond any interaction they might have. Because again, it seemed like the first most natural thing to do would be to think about level effects of having one of these regional universities and then think about the shock. So I'd be curious to hear your thinking on whether you sort of rejected levels as being important or whether that you felt like that was already well understood. So that's what that bullet point says. And this doesn't include, this is purely university spending growth on the nuts and bolts of universities. It's not their construction spending or knock-on effects from student spending. So that's obviously a potential source, as they mentioned in the paper, potential source of positive effects from these institutions. Okay, so as I said 2 seconds ago, is this, should the paper be fully about resilience or should it also be about positive level effects? And the thing that I think is a really interesting question is where would the idea of resilience actually implies that there's offsetting things happening. It's like, if you took it literally, you might think because a manufacturing shock came along, the university then does something to expand spending, which is possible. Although it might be simpler than that. It might simply be that the universities are a source of local demand that doesn't go away. And when manufacturing demand goes away, university-related demand doesn't go away. So it appears to be a buffer. And so maybe that looks like resilience. So that's something that I'd love to hear some discussion about. Like, is it that you actually think they spend more when a shock comes along? And I think that would be the literal interpretation of the regressions. But and one way that could happen is that land prices go down. Bad things happen to the county or the town, and that makes it cheaper for the university to expand, either because they respond to price or because they're political actors that want good things for the county, or they know that by improving the town, it will help the university. But a different mechanism is simply that, like, well, population is not going away at nearly the rate that it otherwise would. And so, like, local restaurants and bars and services don't go away. And to the extent that businesses would get shuttered, those ones are recreated to serve this stable local population. So in my head, as you can tell, I'm trying to sort out these two possibilities. The other thing that they talk about in the paper is that they don't want to push an idea for local agglomerations because they say that these aren't research one universities. So they don't literally use these words, but don't think in terms of like new firms, new tech firms getting founded. But I'm not sure that that's totally true. Maybe there are new local firms being created because of the students who went to school there. They just happen to stick around. I love the fact that Russ used the word anchor, that the university is an anchor, because it's basically like if you have a retail mall, the university is an anchor tenant, and so other stores remain or gather around it. So manufacturing is like Sears, and the university is like an Apple store. If you happen to get an Apple store early on, your mall is gonna stick around, and other stores are gonna locate there. If you have a Sears and no Apple store, Target may not show up. Ironically, so my protest over the paper is that it doesn't talk at all about New Hampshire, and really most good papers should. And I went and looked, and our two regional universities, in fact, started out as normal schools, both Keene State College and Plymouth State, and both are now universities. Both became teachers' colleges, and then became colleges, and then became regional universities. And Keene, clearly, I spend a lot of time down there for reasons I'm not super proud of. I have to coach one of my kids' baseball teams there. And so it's really quite a beautiful place. And I have a couple pictures to suggest that they're also known for their pumpkin festival. They have the world's largest jack-o'-lantern festival at Halloween time. These are two students outside Keene State. And all I want to say is that there's almost no chance that Keene, it was also a manufacturing town, no chance it would be sort of the beautiful and desirable small town that it is now, where they're not a college there. I mean, it's basically all about the college. And you know, these universities build stuff. There's this, you know, there's many stories about campus expansions. My question again is, would they expand anywhere? Are they expanding because there was a manufacturing shock? Not totally sure. They build stuff. They're an award-winning university. And people also ask, apparently according to Google, is Keene State a party school? And someone took the trouble of making sure that you know that the answer is yes. They've got a very nice looking campus, and the town is not just bucolic, but it has a lot of it has no boarded up places and very nice restaurants and such. And I would say that's because of the university. And they also have, in terms of ethnic food, they have this controversially named but very good Vietnamese restaurant. It's controversially named because it's the Pho Keen Great Vietnamese Restaurant. And so there was a significant controversy over that. Here's my resilience story. How much time do I have, David? Am I in danger of running over here? I feel like
I think we're resilient to it. An extra
okay,
minute
good.
If it permits a good joke.
A Sacerdote time shock. I will make two other points, and this is a true resilience story. So you can't see it in the picture, but there was the silk mill. There are a number of mills there that go out of business. But one of them they all get bought for various purposes, and one of them is bought for solar use. Encore Energy builds it, and I would contend that probably doesn't happen if it's a manufacturing town that doesn't have a population and use for the electricity. And so you see a lot of conversion of buildings there. And then another mill building, it literally, when I went on their website, the pop-up, my pop-up blocker wasn't working, and the first thing that pops up says that this is Keene's, the mills of Keene are their #1 off-campus housing, and they have huge flat screen TVs. And so that's the resilience story to me. The cheap land and buildings, you get the bounce back because you have this other anchor tenant. So I think I'm going to stop there. I think those are some of the interesting questions, but the overall theme, I think it's like a really important, interesting one. And I'm obviously pleased with the direction that the results happen to come out. So thank you to the authors.
Great. Okay. So we have time for discussion. Are there people, first of all, if you would like to ask a question from the participants who are not on camera, please raise your hand or turn on your camera and shout out. Okay, there are not other questions in the chat. So I have questions, of course. And if that's okay, I'll just take the privilege and hopefully this will prime the pump. Three points. One is that it's always hard for me to think about the effect of a treatment on a place, because you know, the place is a geographic unit, but what's there is endogenous, right? And so, you know, what's there in terms of the people and the, you know, so it's not, it doesn't kind of hold constant. So I think that's challenging to think about. I'll just point that out. And so the second point is, I really think the resilience thing is so important and fascinating, but I wasn't clear, you know, you have an exogenous, you know, force that caused a university to be in some place, but you didn't isolate exogenous manufacturing changes or declines. Not that that's hard to do, but I didn't see you doing that. It would be helpful, right? You really want the interaction of those things, I think. And so I'm going to make my third comment, which hopefully is a little more useful. So, you know, the thing that always strikes me about universities is they're just a money fountain, right? It's just like a gusher of money in the middle of a place, and it's constantly, you know, just raining money on everything around it. Because you have students and you have faculty and you have grants and you have, just a university is just like this self-generating economy. It's not really self-generating, it's just getting other people's money from the government from out of state, but that's what it's doing, right? So it can't be bad. And so I wonder, if you want to say, well, what is the right comparison of a university? Something else that's a money gusher, where the money is, coming from essentially a hole in the ground, or really from other states and the federal government. It wouldn't be an asylum as much as it would be a hospital, right? Hospitals and universities are the two big ways we basically create artificial, kind of holes of money with stable populations, right? Same number of people and, educated people. And yet I think they have, my strong suspicion, they have very different effects on places. So it would be really interesting, as another, it's not a criticism of what you're doing, but it would be fascinating to be able to make that contrast as well. So to stop there, but anyway, it's really such a cool idea, so creative, and I had no idea of this history, and it's I like it a lot.
Great, thanks so much. Those are three very insightful comments that I'll have to think some more about. You're right about the manufacturing. We sort of just do a very simple, our simple specification right now is just looking at the baseline manufacturing share, at the start of the shock. For example, for the Rust Belt shock, we're looking at the peak of manufacturing employment in the United States and just taking two places that have, similar manufacturing at that time period before the shock. But you're right, we're not capturing sort of exogenous reasons why one county might have more than another. And just sort of while I'm talking about manufacturing, I think Tim had a comment in the chat that I saw briefly that might have been asking about whether the industrial composition was different, so the effect of the shock was different, but we didn't see a differential impact on the manufacturing sector. That might not have been what you were getting at, Tim, but we didn't see that the manufacturing sector was differentially affected, which was one of our sort of hypotheses, is that maybe manufacturing looks different in a university town than in a non-university town, and the manufacturing sector itself is more resilient, but we don't see that. And I like the idea of the hospitals and comparing to hospitals. I think that makes a lot of sense. In terms of thinking about the amount of money that, as you said, is gushing in. Obviously, that would require a different identification design, but definitely something to think more about. I think for us, we were kind of focused on differential selection into who got these counties and sort of political influence as a determinant of that. And the other thing that we sort of point out in the paper is that we are, we're comparing two counties that have pretty high government employment relative to all other counties in the state. So we're comparing counties that have these state universities to counties that have other important government institutions. So I think one thing that comes up is sort of whether universities are different than sort of just other government institutions or employment. And I think the fact that we see the baseline government employment share is similar in the normal and the asylum counties at the start of the shock is interesting and suggestive that there is something special about the universities relative to other, typical government institutions that you might think would smooth out shocks.
Okay, I haven't managed time well, but we have questions from Claudia and then from Tim. So please go ahead, Claudia.
Sure, this was super interesting. I had no idea about this history, and so it's very fascinating. I have a question related to that history and one that's sort of a bit more substantial. So let me start with the silly one. You said that asylums were very desirable. Kankakee was cheering on getting the asylum. I wonder, why is that? What was the perception? Was it an increase in employment? Was it finally some sort of people could get some treatment they deserved? And then the other question, which is a little more substantial, is I wonder if you could sort of elaborate a little bit on sort of the mechanism. There's two things, sort of the money fountain, and then there's the fact that people go to college and then you get a college educated population, presumably staying there. And I know you didn't have time, but could you sort of elaborate on that? Because I think then the policies one would recommend are quite different. One is supporting university and give them money to spend. And the other one is supporting people going to universities and give them subsidies to do so. So I'm wondering, what does sort of your evidence say about that question that we are all sort of grappling with when we think about student debt and things like that? Thanks.
Yeah, sure. So great questions. And I'll just also just say, Greg, if you want to jump in at some point, feel free to. And if you want to add something regarding the first question about history, really good question. They were desirable. I think, so we actually did, and the paper has a lot of examples of newspaper articles that were written at the time that these asylums were determined their locations. And I think some of the main arguments were employment, that they saw it as being a big boost for jobs and money, as well as, the Kankakee article also went on to say that this would improve the reputation of Kankakee as a place instead of some backwater place that it had received this important government institution. And I think there was just it was a period in which like asylums were really, the idea behind them was this compassionate, like restorative institution that communities would be really proud of having these institutions that were really helping people, who needed help to try to make them better. And so I think that it was a big social movement at the time. And so there was a lot of pride surrounding that, but certainly the money and the jobs were important as well. In terms of the mechanisms, I think you're right. There are these two mechanisms, and we kind of consider them in the paper, and they're different and have different policy implications. I think we have we can say something more clearly about the spending mechanism, and I think it's easier for us to make causal claims because we are able to use sort of multipliers from the literature. With the bachelor's degree share, what we can do is we can say that these universities are having this causal impact on the bachelor's share. And we see that it's, roughly 2 percentage points increase, regardless of whether you look at 1980, 2000, 2010, 2018, the increase in the local bachelor's share is about a 2 percentage point increase. Of course, the bachelor's share is increasing over time in the US. And so like the relative increase is declining over time. But
so I apologize. I think these are great questions to answer, but we're going to have to move on to the next paper. I want to give Tim a minute to ask one question and give Russ a minute to respond, and then we'll move forward. I apologize.
Okay, 3 things. 1, it's a great paper. People should read it. 2, the point I was trying to make was that other things equal, you would think that the university sector would lead to a larger share of the export base being the university sector as opposed to, say, manufacturing. So you would tend to think the export-based sector have a different composition. So the question is what that would do. And the third is, I don't recall whether in the paper you looked at small business startups or that kind of thing, because one of my pet theories of how universities might affect local labor markets is, especially in high amenity areas, quirky state colleges and universities can attract people who then decide, I would never have chosen to live here otherwise, but I'm here, I kind of like it, it's kind of an interesting place, there's some good amenities, what the hell, I'll start up this weird business. And of course, my little anecdote, this is economics by anecdote, is Bell's Brewery in Kalamazoo, which was started by a Kalamazoo College dropout, who would never have come to Kalamazoo without Kalamazoo College existing. And I think in many cases, you have things going on in some of these college towns.
Great. Yeah. So thanks for clarifying your point about the export based sector. In terms of so we'll think more about that. In terms of the small business startups, the small firms, entrepreneurship, it's not something we look directly at, but I think it's definitely on the list of things to do in future work. We do spend a decent amount of time in the paper trying to get at whether people are sticking around after graduating, which is something Bruce brought up as well. We don't see dramatic evidence of that. We see a huge difference in the age distribution right around the college going distribution, but or college age part, but not huge effects after that, but definitely to do in future work.
Right,
well.
but like most college graduates don't stick around, but Larry Bell did. So I guess the entrepreneurship thing is different from whether most people stick around.
Absolutely, yeah. So
okay, so I'm going to move us forward. This is a great presentation, great discussion, and just an excellent, really fruitful agenda. So keep going there. Okay, so I'm going to turn it over to to Bryan Stuart. And Bryan, you have 20 minutes, and please go ahead.
Great. Thanks very much. Happy to be here presenting work with Chris Goetz and Brad Hershbein. Both of those guys are in the audience, so feel free to ask questions there. So the starting point for this paper is some of our prior work, which has shown that every recession from 1973 through the Great Recession was followed by local labor market hysteresis. And in particular, what we mean by that is that metro areas that experience more severe employment losses during recessions see lasting declines in things like employment, population, and also importantly, employment to population ratios and earnings per capita. As I'll show you later, these declines are not persistent or not apparent in pre-trends, and they persist for basically as long as we can measure them. And so that leads to the obvious question of what are the sources of this hysteresis? You might imagine that it's large, high-paying employers which shut down or reduce their employment, or it could be that you don't have the entry of small, high-growth employers. Those are stories about the demand side of the market. Certainly there are stories about the supply side that we've already been talking about today. Now, the kind of jumping off point for this paper is that the publicly available data we have access to are really not all that helpful in distinguishing between these explanations. And so what we're going to do is use restricted access census data in order to quantify the sources of local labor market hysteresis. You can think of the presentation today as kind of like a down payment on a much bigger project, where today I'll show you results for the Great Recession using the longitudinal business database. That's going to let us look at things like establishment entry and exit, as well as expansion and contraction. And we're going to do that by comparing metro areas that experience more versus less severe employment losses during the recession. Our prior work has looked at a bunch of recessions, and we're going to do that with the restricted census data. We're also going to use the census of manufacturers and the LEHD to look at a number of other outcomes. Now, really quick, I just want to kind of situate this in the literature. The most important contribution here is evidence on the sources of hysteresis. I think this does complement two really important literatures. One of those literatures looks at recessions and business dynamics. So for example, thinking about how job reallocation varies with the business cycle. And the difference for our paper relative to that literature is that we're going to be looking at post-recession dynamism and looking at whether or not local labor markets change in persistent ways. The other literature that this complements is work on the sources of displaced workers' earnings losses. So whereas that literature has focused on workers, we're going to be focusing on local areas, which will bring up different mechanisms, although there is a common thread in that we're going to be really interested in the role of employers. Okay, so let me just get into it. We're going to be measuring outcomes from the longitudinal business database. That provides us with a longitudinal panel of establishments, which is key to measuring things like expansion and contraction. So for the results today, I'm going to show you years 2003 to 2019, where the outcomes are going to be things like employment or payroll, entry, and exit. I'm also going to show you some cuts by establishment characteristics. So we're going to look at establishments that are young or old or small or large. In all cases, we're going to fix those characteristics as of 2006, before the Great Recession begins. Now, our measure of recession severity is simply the change in log employment from 2007 to 2009 in the metropolitan area. That comes from publicly available data from the BEA, which combines a bunch of different administrative sources in order to measure total wage and salary employment. So when you're thinking about that change in employment from 07 to 09, we think that's especially likely to reflect shifts in labor demand, but I'll talk about that a little bit more later. Now, in the interest of time, I've just got to summarize kind of two facts about recession severity for you. Fact one, which I think is not surprising, is that recession severity varies a lot across metros. Within any given recession, there are some metro areas that experience much more severe employment losses than other metro areas. Fact two, which might be more surprising, is that recession severity varies quite a lot over time within metro areas. So if you think about the average metro area that was hit hard by the Great Recession, that metro area was not hit all that hard by the recession in 2001. And that's going to be helpful for our empirical strategy because it means that interpretation is going to be easier. And in particular, we're not going to have to worry all that much that the results I'm showing you today is just the accumulation of several decades of recession severity. Okay, so our approach here is just to estimate event study regressions. Again, the basic comparison is metro areas that have larger versus smaller employment losses during the Great Recession. And so with this event study regression, we're going to have some metro area outcome, could be log employment or the establishment entry rate, for example, in metro area C and year T. And our key explanatory variable of interest is going to be S, this measure of recession severity, which again is just the change in log employment from 2007 to 2009. The key thing we're interested in this regression are these delta T coefficients, which basically are going to let us see the evolution of local economic activity before the recession, during the recession, and then after the recession, and how that varies in metros that were hit harder versus not. Now, in order to kind of interpret that delta T coefficient as arising from this recession-induced employment loss, we're going to control for division by year fixed effects to absorb broader changes in the economy, as well as metro area specific pre-recession population growth. And that pre-recession population growth is going to be interacted with year fixed effects. You can think about this as basically allowing for differential shifts in labor supply across metro areas, where again, that's pre-recession shifts. Okay, so let me just show you the results. I'm gonna kind of show several figures that look like this. So I'll walk through the first one a little bit more slowly. These are our event study coefficients across years, where we've normalized the result for 2006 to be equal to 0. And the outcome here is log employment in the metro area. Again, that's measured from the LBD. So what you can see before the recession is little evidence of a differential shift in employment, but during the recession, there's a sharp decrease in employment. Now, that decrease in employment is basically mechanical, right? Our explanatory variable of interest is the decrease in employment during the recession. So all this is showing is that in fact shows up in the LBD data as well. However, the post-recession dynamics are not mechanical. And I think this is the most interesting feature of this plot, where we see lasting decreases in log employment after the recession. You can see there's some evidence of a recovery, but that has basically stalled by 2017. And so if you look at the coefficient in 2019, it implies that a metro area, which has 5% greater employment loss during the recession, has 5% lower employment as of 2019. Now, one thing I want to stress is that these effects are relative, right? We're comparing different metro areas that vary in the recession severity. This isn't a statement about absolute employment changes over time. Okay, so we've shown this in our previous work. It's kind of reassuring that it's consistent with the LBD data. The payoff of the LBD is that we can look at changes in employment by establishment characteristic. And so what I'm showing you here, this solid blue line is the point estimate I showed you before, but now I'm also showing you estimates for small establishments and large establishments, where that's based on a cutoff of 100 employees as of 2006. And then I'm showing you results for young versus old establishments as well, using a cutoff of 5 years old in 2006. And the basic pattern here is that we see a similar proportional decline in employment across all of these types of establishments. Of course, large establishments are bigger, and so the total employment loss will be bigger there. I'll have more to say about that later. But in proportional terms, this looks pretty similar. Now, the next outcome that we look at is the average of log payroll per employee in the metro area. And so what we see is a sharp decrease in that measure around the time of the recession, and really very little recovery in mean log payroll per employee afterwards. So those estimates imply that a 5% greater employment loss during the recession translates into about 2% lower payroll per employee some 10 years after the end of the recession. Again, we can break this down by establishment characteristic. And I think this starts to become pretty interesting in that we see a similar decline for all types of establishments, but one. And the big exception here in green squares is for large establishments. So what you see is that during the recession, there was a much more gradual decline in average payroll per employee in large establishments. Over time, however, you see that continue to fall, such that when we get out to 2019, it's a broadly similar total decline in payroll per employee. It's just much slower for these large establishments. Now, when we combine this gradual decline in payroll per employee with the results I showed you 2 slides ago, showing that large establishments did in fact shed their employees at similar rates as other establishments, that implies that large establishments were especially likely to cut or not expand on terms of lower wage jobs. And so that's something we're kind of limited in our ability to look at that more directly with the LBD, but with the LEHD, that's the type of thing that we'll be able to look at very directly. The next outcome I want to show you is on the metro area entry rate of establishments. So here the dependent variable is the number of new establishments in each year relative to the 2006 number of establishments. So we're going to keep that denominator fixed. What you see is a decline in establishment entry during the recession, followed by a persistent decrease in that establishment rate. So this would be consistent with basically just fewer businesses entering in these metro areas that had a more severe employment loss during the Great Recession, where again, that persists for 10 years after the end of the recession. And the final outcome we can look at here is the exit rate of establishments. So you can see that there's an increase in exits during the recession that declines over time. And I think what's most interesting is that that declines actually to a lower level in the long run. And so that would be consistent with basically an overall reduction in the dynamism of these local labor markets, such that you have fewer establishments entering and fewer establishments exiting after the recession. We can break the exit rate regressions down by establishment characteristic as well. And you see broadly similar patterns, again, with the exception of large establishments, where those point estimates are much smaller than for any of the others. Now, if I had zoomed in just on the large establishment coefficients, you still would have seen a similar hump-shaped pattern. And of course, those large establishments are really big compared to small establishments. And so the employment consequences of those exits are going to be pretty substantial. Okay, so those are a number of event study results where I think we can start to learn some more about what's going on in local labor markets by looking at the cuts by establishment characteristics. What we're going to do, the final exercise I'll show you today, is a decomposition of the change in employment. And in particular, we're going to think of the change in employment from 2006 to 2014. Now, just as an accounting matter, that change in employment depends on the gain in employment from new establishments, the loss in employment from those which close, as well as changes in employment at establishments that remain open. And the establishments that remain open from 2006 to 2014 can either expand their employment or they can contract their employment. We can further decompose those channels into establishment size and age. Now, I'm not walking through the kind of decomposition equation here, but basically what comes out of this is the percent change in employment in a metro area is going to be a linear function of a bunch of different components. And what we're going to do is just estimate a regression where each of those components is the dependent variable. And since everything is linear here, that'll provide us with an exact decomposition of the total recession-induced employment loss into the contribution of each component. Okay, so I'm going to be showing you on the next slide these theta coefficients, which are coefficients on our measure of recession severity. But I'll kind of walk through those numbers and hopefully that'll make this more clear. Okay, so the first row that I'm showing you here is just the dependent variable is the percent change in employment in a metro area from 2006 to 2014, where we're regressing that on the change in log employment during the recession. So you can basically interpret this as an elasticity, and it implies that a 10% greater employment loss during the recession leads to a 12.8% decline in employment from 2006 to 2014. This is just kind of a long difference regression. Now, that total change in employment can be decomposed into 4 constituent parts. It can be decomposed into entry, exit, expansion, and contraction. I think the easiest way to interpret these coefficients, given the time that we have, is just to think about relative effects here. And so this last column tells you the share of the total employment decline that is explained by each component. So for example, the 17.1 says that 17% of the total decline in employment is because of a reduction in establishment entry. And if we look across the board here, we see that establishment exit stands out as the single largest category, although the other margins are important as well. So expansion, contraction, and entry all account for 17 to 21% of the employment loss. This isn't just a simple story about the exit of establishments. The other margins matter as well. Now for exit, expansion, and contraction, we can further decompose that into establishment characteristics. And I've now hit you with kind of a wall of numbers. So let me just summarize these in the bottom right, kind of draw some of the most interesting patterns here. So about 60% of this employment decline, the recession-induced employment decline, is due to the extensive margin, where we think about lower entry or higher exit. 44% of the employment decrease occurs among large establishments, with 40% in small establishments. We can also think about this in terms of establishment age, where we see that 56% of the decline is due to old establishments and 28% is due to young establishments. If we were to focus on the single largest age by size grouping, it would be old and large establishments, which account for fully a third of the employment loss. But again, I think this is a broad picture in that a lot of factors matter here. Okay, so let me just conclude. This paper and our prior work shows that recessions lead to long-lasting effects on local labor markets. We see declines in employment, declines in payroll per employee, with I think especially interesting results for large establishments, which appear to disproportionately cut low-wage jobs. Now, if we connect these results back to the motivating question of why don't metro areas recover the jobs which are lost during the recession, let me just kind of draw some suggestive conclusions here. So first of all, the decomposition that I just walked through showed that old establishments account for about 56% of the employment decline. One potential explanation there is that these metro areas face high adjustment costs because basically these old establishments have durable capital. That capital is not on the technological frontier. And so it's not so easy for new employers to move in and just replace those old establishments. We also see large establishments play a big role in that they account for about 44% of the employment loss. When you think about those large establishments, it seems likely that there are effects which are amplified through local production networks, right? When Ford Motors cuts jobs, it has a lot of suppliers that cut as well. And the final thing I want to highlight is that reduced entry of establishments, as well as decreases in employment among young establishments, are quite important as well. And so that would be consistent with lower amounts of job creation and more generally just less dynamism in these local labor markets. We got a lot of work to do. And so we're going to look at other recessions. Our previous work has shown that the Great Recession is not unique and that in fact, these results are pretty comparable across recessions. So we're going to be interested in whether or not that continues once we look at these detailed sources. And then finally, we'll have the census of manufacturers, the LEHD, and a link between the LEHD and burning glass job postings, which will help us shed a lot of light on employer-employee matching and also job postings and kind of job fills as well. So with that, I'll conclude and thank you very much.
Great. Okay, excellent. So so our discussant, Tilban Wachter, is not present, and I'm not sure it's super helpful for me to walk through his slides. So I think it would probably be better just to have a discussion of this work. And so I welcome questions and from others who are here. Claudia, please go ahead. And then Bruce.
Thank you. Super interesting, Brian and Brad. I was wondering if you guys sort of have a sense of how your effective business cycle shocks compare with just regular sort of regular shocks, if you want. So by that I mean sort of more sort of secular movements away from some sectors and other away from some skills and towards others, but also perhaps just the overall sort of changes that happen in the economy. My sense is that sort of like large establishment, by the virtue of being large, whatever happens to them, whether it's idiosyncratic or aggregate, matters much more than sort of the smaller one. And then there's the whole discussion of sort of young firms that we've had sort of since Healthy Wangers work. So I wonder if you sort of can isolate a little bit how much of this is recession, how much of this is just how sort of job dynamics works.
Yeah, that's a great question, Claudia. Thanks very much. One of the things that we've shown in previous work is that this pattern of, say, lasting employment decreases is not unique to recession. So if you look in a non-recessionary period, and you compare metro areas that have more versus less employment growth or declines in a period, those seem to be pretty persistent. You know, if there are any time series people in the audience, they might jump on me for this, but you can think about that as just employment. If employment were a random walk, that might be the type of thing that you would see. Now that's not exact, we're not making that claim, and that's not exactly what we're doing, but this looks like employment losses in general have those kinds of consequences. I think when we're thinking about local labor markets, the simple story that makes sense to me is just that jobs are more mobile than people. And that explains a lot of what we're finding in terms of impacts on employment rates or earnings per capita. We have not yet extended that analysis to everything that I showed you today, but I think it's a great question and an important thing for us to do going forward. Thanks.
Go ahead, Bruce.
Thanks very much for the paper. You know, this is either a stupid or brilliant question, I'm not sure. Are you thinking, I'm just wondering, are you thinking about this as like accelerating things that would have happened anyway? You know, because obviously the people, you know, the employment has to go somewhere. And so is it that the shock accelerated something, something that was destined to happen anyway? And there's a lot of this sort of movement from, you know, movement to the South, essentially?
Yeah, no, that's an important question. I think our overall take is that it's not obvious these are things that would have happened irregardless. You know, in the data, the thing that points to that is the fact that these are not places where you're experiencing declines in employment or any of the indicators we can look at before recessions. Now, you might have in mind like an SS adjustment model where the kind of latent productivity of some of these places is declining over time, and you just need the recession to come along and have a big enough shock to those places. That's not a model that I think we can reject, and we haven't thought of how to reject that model more generally. What I would say is when you think about like search and matching in the labor market, employers' ability to kind of recover their financing conditions, if you have these employment losses occur more slowly over an extended period of time, I think we would expect there to be different impacts on these local labor markets. So if you, just to take one simple example, if you think about like human capital depreciation because workers experience unemployment during the recession, if you got a big mass of people that are unemployed, their skills could depreciate, that could have long lasting effects on these local areas. And that's a sense in which, you know, losing 5% of your jobs in 2 years is a lot worse than losing 0.1% of those jobs over a multi-decade period. So that's, I think ultimately that's a lot of hand waving to talk through how we think through that, Bruce, but empirically, I'm not sure we're able to give more on that.
Can I jump in for a sec, Brian?
Please.
You know, one thing that's really nice about the data and some of the data sets we're going to be using is that we've just begun to scratch the surface in terms of the characteristics that we can look at for the different establishments. And one of the ones that we have yet to do, but could and probably will in the future, is a measure of at least revenue productivity. Other forms of productivity are a little bit harder outside of the manufacturing sector. But if you think that there are some trailing productivity establishments are likely at higher risk, and that this was going to be some of the thing that caused the adjustment to happen sooner, and then you're having the cleansing, we'll be able to look at that heterogeneously versus establishments that seem to be on sounder financial and productivity footing earlier, especially once we get into the LEHD and can actually look at that for, say, AKM effects. So that is one of the things that we want to look at going forward.
Can I ask a question? I don't see. Yeah, I'm having trouble trying to understand how to think about this. It just can't be that every time a place loses employment, it never comes back, right? So there must be some dynamics. I mean, or maybe there's something, or there must be either there's something exceptional about this period. Right? I mean, like, there's the work by Danny Yegan about, hysteresis. And I mean, I think there's been a rebound, even in the places he was talking about, just slow. And we know the rebound from the last recession was slower than prior recessions. But I mean, so it's not that I doubt the scarring effect, but it's sort of the notion that this is just a random walk. And if you get a negative shock to employment, I know you, Brian, you said that's not what you're saying, but that's how I'm reading your results. So how should I understand this in some bigger picture?
So I think the key there is that these are about relative effects and not absolute effects. So, employment was growing throughout this period, and that's true of the places that experience more severe recessions. Just think about that as like they have a decline in employment during the recession, and then that gap that emerges during the recession in terms of employment persists over time. So one thing that could be consistent with is that jobs are not being created in places that are hit hard, but they are being created in places that are not hit hard by recessions. If you want to think about like geographic spillovers, that's one possibility. All that these regressions can identify are just these relative differences between metro areas. So yeah, I think you shouldn't think about this as like total jobs over time. This is about relative differences between metro areas.
So in that case, it would be really helpful to understand like what are the characteristics of places that proved more versus less resilient or had more great, is it in, and I'm sure you're working on this, right? But is it industry structure? Is it education? Were those places always, every time they got hit, they always did that? I think Tim Bartik wants to jump in here as well. So please go ahead.
Let me just, one thing I'll say, David, on the resiliency point, like Brad and I would love to know, and Chris, we would all love to know, like, what are the characteristics that make these places more resilient? We did a lot of cuts based on like worker education, age structure, immigration, industry structure. And a lot of that came out was not any clear evidence that there are systematic differences in which places are more or less resilient to these employment changes over time. So I agree that's an important question. We've not found any evidence that there's systematic differences there.
Last interjection before I turn it over to Tim did you also look at the population margin, right? How much of this are people staying in place? Are they going out?
No, population declines. We've used some of the IRS migration data, which shows that basically all of the population decline is due to a reduction in in-migration. So this isn't the story that basically people are fleeing these metro areas that are getting hit. It's that people are not moving to those metro areas.
So that says the people who lose jobs stay there non-employed.
Yeah, again, we with the LEHD data, we're going to be able to make more conclusive statements about that. But I think that's also broadly consistent with Danny's work as well.
Yeah, that's one of the goals, is to figure out which types of individuals are moving or staying, where in the earnings distribution they are, and try to decompose that more than we've been able to do in the past.
Cool. Please go ahead, Tim.
Well, I guess the thing I would say is I'd be curious, David, to ask you why. See, I actually think urban growth is a random walk. I mean, demand and supply shocks occur. It doesn't mean that some areas don't recover. Of course, some areas recover. They figure out how to substitute for the industries they lost. They figure out how to attract additional business. They figure out how to get entrepreneurs started. They figure out how to improve their labor force, whatever. They make investments. Other areas get worse. They their tax base has been crippled by the loss of jobs. The public service quality deteriorates. All these things go on. They get worse. So maybe on average it's a random walk, but it doesn't mean that areas can't recover. And I don't know why that's I guess I don't know why that's inconsistent with what we see in the aggregate economy. I mean, this is kind of what's going on locally. There are these shocks occurring all the time, the economy, positive and negative, and some impinge locally. And I don't see why on average it couldn't resemble a random shock process.
I believe the shocks could be random. I guess I sort of think there's some reversion, like mean reversion, but maybe not. I mean, it would be great to write the paper that says basically employment growth is a random walk at the, because I mean, that's a really interesting model. And I know, but so I'm not saying it's not the right model. That's not how I thought about it. I'm open to that idea, but it seems a bit radical to me. But I mean, I agree that part of it, the forces, as you say, they're not just statistical forces, right? There's policy forces that could exacerbate or mitigate these shocks, right? And so, for example, Ed Glazer argued recently in his thing about, urban decline, or, he says, like, the US is much more susceptible to this than more centralized countries, because basically places are sort of on their own with their tax base. And once they take a negative shock, then the tax base declines and people leave, and it's sort of it feeds on itself. Whereas in, many European countries, they just wouldn't allow that. If that happened to Frankfurt, you just dump money into Frankfurt until it came back, right? It couldn't happen. So, so clearly, I don't think this could be just a pure statistical outgrowth of the data. It has to do as well with, many, many choices that are being made, but it may be very well that the US looks more like that than other places. That's really interesting.
One thing I would add to that, which comes from the previous work we've done, is that that is true not just for the Great Recession, but basically every recession from 1973 to today. So you might, your prior could have been that, like, the Great Recession or the early 80s recession were different because those were more severe. We see similarly persistent declines in employment after, say, the 90 to 91 recession or the 2001 recession. And so this is a broad feature, at least from 1973 to 2009, we can trace out similar impacts. And there's been a lot that's changed in, like, labor market dynamics over that period. So it does seem to be a quite kind of widespread feature of local labor markets that we've seen.
Great. Okay. Any further questions? I think, we're actually right back on schedule. But it was a great presentation, and I thought an excellent discussion as well. I'm sorry Till wasn't here, but you have his slides. So why don't we go to the third paper by Tim Bartik.
Okay, can people see the screen? Good. So actually, one interesting thing I was thinking about as I listened to these other presentations is how they fit together, the three papers, because they're quite different, but there is some overlap. And I might see if we can, be interesting to have some discussion of what the overlap here is a little bit. So this paper is a little bit different. What I'm looking at here, whoops, let's see, how come it's not going down? There we go. What I'm looking at here is long run effects, not recession, so it differs from the prior paper, of labor demand shocks to different local areas, but labor demand shocks to different types of occupations. And I'm looking at how the effects vary by group and by local characteristics. And one of the characteristics I include are the college graduation rate in the local area. So that overlaps with the first paper. And from my perspective, part of this came about from my interest in state and local economic development policies, where a longstanding issue is, does it make a difference what types of jobs you attract? And, a lot of people think it does, but there really is very little empirical evidence on this. And so this came up, for example, when Amazon headquarters 2 came along, and there was this big competition, and these jobs paid supposedly, according to Amazon, $150,000 a year. One issue was, will this actually help local residents? I mean, or is Amazon just going to move in jobs and held by in-migrants, and local residents won't get any of the jobs? Would this really pay off? And so, you know, a lot of people would say, no, it may not, but is there really any evidence of that? And the other thing was sparked really by David's paper, or his presentation at the ASSA a few years ago, that really tried to look at occupational polarization at a local level, and argued that this polarization in some of the larger cities could explain some of the declines in relative wages of non-college graduates. And so there's kind of this interest in this from a local perspective, what kind of economic development policy we should have, and interest in this from kind of a national labor market perspective. Let's understand a little bit more why non-college graduates aren't doing as well. To what extent does it have to do with some of the industrial and occupational trends we see? And the key finding is that there's very strong support for David's hypothesis that other people have also advanced as well, Harry Holzer, for example, that mid-jobs are by far the most important for explaining local labor market outcomes, particularly for non-college grads. You know, but I do think this raises some real issues of what on earth do you do about that in terms of policy, because a lot of these jobs are in manufacturing, and the question is, what's the future of manufacturing? And that depends in part on policy, but I also think you need to look at other avenues than simply demand shocks to mid-jobs if you want to boost wages and earnings. So I'll just get right into the model. The model is looking at long-run changes using the Census and ACS data from 2000 to 2015-19 in labor market outcomes. And I look at a number of labor market outcomes in the paper for a number of groups. But the group I'm going to focus on in this presentation today are either non-college graduates or college graduates, and I'm going to focus on their earnings. Now, I control for various demographic mix, the age mix within college graduates and non-college graduates in various areas. I also control for local prices, or at least local housing prices. So these are real earnings changes. And I'm looking at demand shocks to 3 types of occupations I'm going to call low, middle, and high. Get into that in a minute, what these low, middle, and high occupations are. And I want to know what the effects of these demand shocks are and how they vary with, 1, the baseline employment rate in the commuting zone, and 2, the baseline college graduation rate in the commuting zone. And the equation is defined so that I can look at effects at the means and how they vary with these interaction terms. The sample are commuting zones, all the commuting zones, 371 of them that are greater than 100,000 population. This is 96% of the US population. And as I said, I'm just focusing on the results for non-college and college graduates. In the paper, I also talk about different racial groups, for example. The first thing I want to show is that, in fact, there are a lot of differences in real earnings trends as I measure them here for BA versus non-BA workers by these commuting zones. And there are some interesting patterns just there to look at. So you have some areas that have just done terribly for both. And by the way, all these are relative to the US as a whole. These are not absolute changes, these are relative to the US as a whole. So there are some areas that have just done terribly for both non-college and college workers in terms of real earnings growth, like the Detroit area. All of these commuting zones, since commuting zones don't have assigned names, I just assign the name of the largest county in each commuting zone. So Wayne County, Detroit did terribly, Los Angeles did terribly, Miami did terribly. Other areas have done quite well for college graduates, like the San Francisco Bay Area, Alameda, California, and not so well for non-college grads. On the other hand, the Pittsburgh area, which was already mentioned earlier, has done quite well for non-college graduates, not so well for college graduates. And then there are some areas like Seattle area, the Twin Cities area in Minnesota, that have done well for both groups. So there is quite a disparate pattern across the US in these relative real earnings trends. As I said, I pretty much used David's, I tried as closely as I could to use his classification of occupations. There are high, middle, and low. You can argue about whether you should call these high skill, middle skill, and low skill, or high wage, middle wage, and low wage. But basically the high is managers, executives, professionals, a few sales occupations. Middle includes a lot of production operative occupations and a lot of retail sales and clerical administrative support. And low includes laborers, mechanics, services of various sorts. And not surprisingly, since I'm using the same definitions, I come up with a similar result to what David came up with, which is that there's actually been a decline in these mid-wage jobs, not just in percentage of the total number of jobs, but in absolute terms. And there's been growth in both high and low jobs, particularly in high jobs. Now, an interesting thing I did, this has nothing to do with the regression, but I did a kind of a non-geographic type of shift share, which asked the question, to what extent are these overall trends due to different industry growth of industries that have different occupational shares of the three types of occupations versus shifts within industries. So for example, for mid jobs, a key industry share, the industry share effect is negative. That is, on whole, industries, the industry pattern of growth, even if there had been no shifts within industries and occupational composition, was such as to lower the mid share of jobs. And when you look at it and break it down by industry, a lot of this is the decline of manufacturing. That essentially manufacturing decline, manufacturing includes a lot of mid jobs. That explains a lot of what's going on in mid jobs. Not all of it though. In low jobs, a lot's explained also by industry share effects, particularly the rapid growth in the restaurant industry, which has a lot of low jobs, is one of the key ones, but there are others as well. And then the other thing that's going on is the shift of occupations within industries, of which the essentially across many industries, there's been a shift from mid-occupation jobs to high occupation jobs. That's occurred across many industries. It's not really industry specific much at all. Okay, so one of the right-hand side variables is a demand shock to a commuting zone's occupational demand for these three types of occupations. So how is that created? It's essentially a variation of this share effect instrument, which I've used a lot, which I did not invent the term. It's called the Bartik instrument, but I did not name it that. But I'm happy, at this stage of my career, I'm happy to just accept the name. Essentially, for each occupation, I asked the following question: how much would we predict demand to go up in that CZ for that occupation if you took every industry in the CZ, you blew it up by what happened in industry in the nation, and you furthermore assumed that the industry occupational matrix changed in each area in the same way it's changed in the nation? So that's the basic idea. And then it's expressed, though, as a percentage of total employment in all industries in the CZ in the base period. So it's a percentage shock to overall employment, not a percentage shock to the occupational type, if I'm being clear here. And if you sum this over the three occupational groups, it adds up to the total geographic share effect and shift share analysis, or the Bartik instrument, whatever you want to call it. So it's additive, which is what I was trying to get at here. And the thing to recognize is that this is large. The differences across CZs is largely driven by industries whose share of total employment in the CZ varies a lot from CZ to CZ. And that is mainly export-based industries. So you're not going to get much from some industries that mainly sell to a local market. Okay. When you look at this across the pattern across CZs, what's going on, the thing I want to emphasize here, first of all, there is considerable variation in these demand shocks. The standard deviation is about 2 or 3% for each of the demand shocks. However, one thing I want to emphasize is when we actually look at it, the variation across Cs is largely driven by whether the CZ has industries whose baseline occupational share of the 3 different occupation types differ a lot. It's not driven by differences in having a lot of industries that shifted differently. And the reason for that is basically these occupational shifts within industries occurred across so many industries that it really doesn't drive the differentials across the CZ. So most of this is things like a CZ happened to have a lot of manufacturing industries, therefore it had a high negative mid shock. Okay, so here are some regression results. And again, these are 2 different regressions, one in one column, one in the other column. One's for the change in real earnings from 2000 to the 2015-2019 period for those with less than a BA. Again, this controls for local prices. And the other is the change for those with a BA or more. The key thing I want to emphasize here is at the means of the employment rate index and the college graduation rate index, at the mean over the entire sample of these 2 indices in the baseline period. Essentially, the effect of a mid-occupation shock is the only thing that's statistically significant. And it's much higher for the non-college group. It's about 3 times higher, almost 3 times higher. And it's a large effect in the sense that the standard deviation across CZs of this mid-shock is about 3%. So since the coefficient is 1.951, the overall effect is about 6%. So we're saying a 1 standard deviation change in this mid-shock would be associated with about a 6% difference in real earnings for non-college graduates over this time period. So that's I would say that's certainly a non-negligible effect. There are also significant interaction terms. However, like as usual, it's hard to interpret interaction terms. At least I find it very hard to figure out what the hell they mean, unless I actually look at what are the derivatives at the different values of the interaction terms. So that's what the next slide does. So, okay, so what does this slide do? It asks, what is the effect of a 1% shock to either high, middle, or low shocks for non-college graduates and college graduates in commuting zones which have different baseline characteristics of either the employment to population ratio in 2000 or the college graduation rate in 2000. And so I start out with, focusing on a CZ that's at the median for all CZs of these 2 rates. And that's why the middle column is the same both in panel A and panel B. Those are for CZs that have a median value of the employment rate in the year 2000 and a median value of the college graduation rate. And so you can see, for example, for the mid-shock, the effect at the median on the non-college real earnings is 1.575. A 1% shock would cause about a 1.6% change in real earnings. For college graduates, about half as much. In addition to that, I calculated the effects of an average shock. So what's an average shock? By an average shock, I mean, in general, when an area experiences a increase or decline in employment, it's going to be a mix of high, middle, and low jobs, right? And so what I did is I regressed the overall demand shock on the 3 different components, and you end up that the average 1% demand shock, the average share effect shock, is about 30% high occupations, 44% mid, 27% low. And if you look at that, that's what the bottom thing shows, the effect of an average shock. And as you can see, one of the key things is that the effect of an average shock is much higher for non-college graduates than for college graduates, which we already showed originally. But the effect of an average shock is much higher, and it's pretty high. The standard deviation of the overall shock is about 7%. So again, we're talking about something that's about at the median is about 5.5 or 6%, the 0.7765, and at the 90th percentile employment rate, it's higher. So what are some of the patterns we see? Well, first of all, there's some increase in the earnings effect on non-college graduates as you have a tighter labor market. And the other thing is you do see some evidence of what you could call a mismatch effect. What I mean by that is the following, that when you have a CZ that started out with a very tight labor market at the 90th percentile of the employment rate, a shock to these high occupations actually has a negative effect on real earnings. Minus 1.856. That's the top thing there. And you could view that as like a gentrification effect. Essentially, these CZs, you move in high jobs. It doesn't really help non-college graduates very much. All it does is drive up local prices from their perspective. On the other hand, in such a tight labor market, it's also the case that low jobs actually can pay off. That the labor market's really tight, and potentially wages are pushed up quite a bit for non-college workers in such a tight labor market, even for low jobs. So so there is some evidence that whether or not the jobs are somewhat matched to the particular group makes a difference. So I view that as some evidence for the notion that, yes, if you want to help non-college workers, mid jobs help the most. In some circumstances, low paying occupations can also help. High paying occupations tend not to pay off for this group. Now, one thing I want to point out here is that when you actually look at it though across areas, so this actually takes this model and then asks the following question: for the largest CZs, the ones that exceed 2.5 million in population, which has the higher effect, mid jobs, low jobs, or high jobs? I mean, the previous thing just kind of arbitrarily changed these things independently. This actually looks at actual CZs that have different college graduation rates, different employment rates in a base period, and asks if you were just a local economic developer trying to go after jobs and you could somehow pick a mid job, a high job, or a low job, what would you pick? And the answer is basically for every single one of these large CZs, a shock to mid jobs has a positive effect. And in almost all cases, shocks to low or high jobs have negative effects on non-college graduates. Now, there are 371 CZs. There are CZs for which the combination of employment rate and college graduation rate is such that you would predict that either a high shock or a low shock has more of an effect. But they tend to be somewhat weird CZs with somewhat weird combination of characteristics. The overwhelming majority of the population of the US lives in commuting zones where mid jobs pay off. Attracting mid jobs to the area pays off far more than attracting high or low jobs. In fact, high or low jobs tend to have negative effects. The other thing to ask a little bit, though, is how easy it is to attract mid jobs. So this is simply a table that looks at some of the larger export-based industries. And I classify industries as export-based if their location quotient, that is their the percentage of employment in that industry, how much that varies across CZs in the nation. Industries where the location quotient, the employment share of industry varies a lot, tend to be export-based industries. So I picked some high standard deviation location quotient industries that look like they're export-based industries as well. And I looked at what's their share that these had in the most recent time period in low occupations, mid occupations, high occupations. And the ones that are bolder are ones that are at least one standard deviation above the average in their share of either low, middle, or high occupations. And what you can see from this is basically most of the high mid occupation jobs, sectors, industries that are export based are in manufacturing. Not every manufacturing industry is like that. For example, pharmaceuticals is not like that. But a lot of the high mid occupation sectors are manufacturing. The one that isn't is there's a business support services area that's high in mid jobs. But generally, if you were telling local economic developers target mid jobs, you'd be telling them pretty much to target certain manufacturing industries. And the question is whether that makes sense as an economic development strategy, given the problems of U.S. manufacturing.
Tim, I just want to let you know you're over time, so I just want to.
Okay, let me finish. I got one more slide.
Sure.
Yeah. So the summary is simply mid shocks tend to have the greatest effects, especially for less educated groups. I think the issue is that we need to think about is, if you believe this analysis, what's going to happen to U.S. manufacturing? And what do we want to have happen? Does the U.S. have a manufacturing policy? Are we going to continue to see job loss in manufacturing? Or will the pandemic cause some reshoring of jobs or some interest in having U.S. manufacturing capacity? There are local areas that have followed manufacturing strategies successfully. I happen to live an hour south of Grand Rapids, Michigan, which has had considerable manufacturing job growth over the past 20 years. So it is possible. It's not easy, but it's possible. So I think one issue is for U.S. policy. What should we do about manufacturing? Second issue is for local policy. What should they do about manufacturing? But the third issue is, if you do think that certainly some manufacturing industries will continue to have problems, it raises the issue of whether or not, if we really want to boost earnings for less educated groups, whether we need to also think about how we increase mobility from mid jobs to high jobs, and how do we improve wages in low jobs. In other words, all these estimates are conditional on labor market institutions. They're conditional on how we've structured job training. They're conditional on how we set wage policy, or rather how we don't set wage policy. They're conditional on unions and whether we have them, whether we have wage boards, which we don't. So I do think that one issue this raises is the limits of industrial policy or local economic development policy in favorably improving earnings for less educated groups. Let me just stop there.
Okay, terrific. Tim, do you want to? Oh, great. Okay, Claudia, please go ahead with your discussion.
Yes. All right, can you all see my screen? And I would like to pick up my slides. This is, by the way, the place where I was born in Italy, in case any one of you needs like a little pick-me-up at 5:30 on a Friday. I look at it because I haven't been in 2 years, so I just look at it all the time. Isn't it pretty? All right, now you're all semi-awake. So first of all, thank you so much for having me here in the discussion. There's a lot of things in this paper that are sort of dear to my heart. There's mismatch, there's sort of local labor markets, there's demand shocks. So these are a perfect match. I want to stress first that this is one paper, but it's part of a much larger research agenda that Tim has been sort of bringing to the fore for quite a few years. And it's based essentially on a need from policymakers to decide what to do in several difficult situations. In recent years, it has become sort of more and more apparent that there's competition among local areas in a federal nation such as ours. And so there's local policies that trying to attract employers to modify the tax code to give advantages to firms. There's also federal policies that target specific places. And so when we have all of these sort of like differences between local areas, it makes sense to think, how do we do this best? Is there a way in which we can sort of maximize the bang for our buck, being the buck of the people, the buck of local governments? And I think like the most recent example that Tim also mentioned was Amazon HQ2. Now, this is a particularly interesting example because of the type of jobs that it may create. Why would you even think about the type of jobs? Well, we know that shocks to job creation affect workers differently, depending on how much education these workers have and how much they used to earn. And in fact, these different effects depends exactly on what kind of jobs are being destroyed. And you can think basically of several papers that David Autor has written to look at that idea. So this paper goes one step further and says, well, okay, so what about heterogeneity in the local workforce composition? What about heterogeneity in the places? In other words, if you think of Amazon, is in fact sort of like the creation of high-end jobs good for every town? Should every place put a bid for Amazon HQ2? How should we think about that? Another thing you can think of is there's a lot of rhetoric about good jobs, creating good jobs. And what the question that we are asking is, what are good jobs anyway? Right? And for whom are they good? So that's sort of the name of the game. I'm going to go relatively fast on the summary, given that we're a little over time, but please sort of ask questions afterwards if you want. So guess what? Manufacturing jobs are good jobs. You are shocked. Before sort of giving you how we get at this conclusion that I think is sort of important and troubling at the same time, let me tell you exactly what we look at. There's two dimensions of heterogeneity in the workforce: college, non-college, and black and white. Tim didn't talk about black and white very much, but I actually think it's particularly relevant in this sort of labor market that we are seeing right now. And there's only one dimension of heterogeneity in jobs. Jobs are sort of ordered in some kind of very loose job ladder. There's low, middle, and high jobs. You can think of this as based on wage levels and education required for the job. So I'm going to call them, for example, no college, high wage, no college, low wage, and so on and so forth. The results are that, as you saw just a few minutes ago, is that mid-level jobs, those that do not require college, but pay a high wage, are in fact on average associated with the largest increases in local employment and real earnings. Somewhat surprisingly, low-level jobs are generally not that useful. They are specifically for sort of no college and Black workers, but only in local areas that have a high employment to population ratios and low college ratios. So this is interesting to me because I think it suggests an important role for labor market attachment. So if you live in an area that has already a lot of employment relative to the US, then it's very likely that some of these lower educated and Black workers are already in the labor force. Then the creation of low-level jobs can be helpful. I think this is also important to keep in mind for what I'm going to talk about next, which is sort of how do we even estimate these things? So sort of keep that in mind for a second. Perhaps we may also want to think about how do we boost labor market attachment. This is a sort of like an issue that simply providing jobs doesn't seem to do it. There's a role for sort of the previous conditions of the local area. So that's another thing that I thought was quite interesting. So next, I'm going to discuss a little bit how do we identify these effects. And the way we're going to do it is through a modified shift share instrument. And here sort of I'm spelling it out so that we can talk about different pieces. Just sort of to remind the audience, the classic shift share instrument, so to speak, uses industry shares in a baseline period of your choice. Let's call it T0. So this is my first term over here. And those are used as a way to filter out, so to speak, a national shock to those industries. So this would be the second term, the national industry shift. Because we are interested in occupation here, there's an extra bit, which is this shift into the proportion of a specific occupation, O, accounted for by a specific industry. So for example, take all of the accountants, some of them will be in manufacturing, some of them will be in fire, some of them will be presumably in professional services, and so on and so forth. That's the bit, the extra shift. You may be changing the proportion of each occupation that's accounted for by each different industries. Then you take all of this together, and we're going to call that the shock. The shock to occupation O in commuting zone Z at time T. So the first question I had is, if we're doing occupation, if we're in the business of thinking that occupation are good proxies for human capital, then why don't we go occupation all the way? Why do we sort of filter it through industries? Well, then I sort of answered myself and said, perhaps there's a presumption that the shocks, the true economic shocks, are at industry level. There's a sense in which people start liking yogurt, and that hits the yogurt industry, doesn't hit accountants. Maybe, although we do know that there's a big literature on skills, and skills, in my opinion, align a little bit more with occupations. But in any case, what I was trying to sort of figure out here is, when we do this sort of shift-share design, the way I think about it is like identification relies on the fact that the local industry shares measure the exogenous differential exposure to the common shock. They filter through the common shock. But here, I'm not sure which is the shock and which is the filter, so to speak. I think it would be really interesting to think about that, especially sort of for the interpretation of results. Because if I think of sort of the polarization literature, I think of a skill shock that hits certain types of skills and therefore certain types of occupations. If I think instead of things like demand shocks, goods demand shocks, then I want to go the industry route. And either could be valid, it's just I think it would be interesting to discuss the interpretation of that. So I also have sort of a suggestion to maybe sort of try different instruments here to try to make sense of what I just said. So if you really think that the shocks hit the industries, then you could use sort of the ideas of sort of having high, low, and middle occupation, just apply them to industry altogether. Now you have high, medium, and low industries, and that's going to be based on however many people have a college education in there, and perhaps you can also look like the wage distribution. And then you can go with sort of the classic shift-share design without having to sort of complicate with this extra piece. On the other hand, you might decide that, no, I really think this is a shock to skills and occupations, and then you could think of constructing a shift-share instrument that's predicated on occupation without passing through industries. You may decide, in fact, to keep both, but I would really appreciate like some kind of discussion. How do these things relate to each other? Because I really think that in the end, industries and occupation are just ways that economists use to make sense of reality. What we really want to talk about is human capital, and that's just ways we have to do it, but they're somewhat artificial. So
just a quick interjection. We only have 3.5 minutes left, so
yes,
I'm happy to hear the rest of the comments, but you might want to leave an extra minute or two just for Tim to respond and so on.
Sure. I actually have just 2 slides. So so this is the same regression that Tim showed you, just in a different form. What I wanted to sort of like highlight is that we're going to look at mostly at sort of beta 2 and beta 3. This is where I said, so X are the controls, and this is where I told you that the employment rate and the baseline sort of matters. It means that the interaction between the shock and your employment rate actually sort of gives sort of like these coefficients are interesting. That's where we get. So let me sort of super quickly make this point. In the paper, sort of, we talk about this shock as a good proxy for shocks to local export-based industry due to the expansion of the national demand. But there is obviously the question of, are these industry shares actually predicting, you know, the outcomes maybe through some other channels? And I put here some channels that I thought would be interesting to to investigate. One of them is perhaps dynamism. The income or the tax base is something that was mentioned as well. And by the way, in my view, this wouldn't make the exercise any less interesting, because the analysis could be extremely insightful, even if you don't have perfect heterogeneity. So some minor things that were already sort of like brought up. The immigration hypothesis is very interesting. So I would actually dig into it a little bit. You could do it with the ACS. And let me sort of only talk about this bit that I thought was sort of important but missing. You would think that if a lot of high-end jobs come to town, then if town is sort of rich in non-college educated people, then they can't take those jobs, but their kids might. And they may decide to, in fact, go to college, especially if they have sort of like one of these universities that we saw at the beginning that seem to sort of increase the resilience of the place. And so I think it would be really interesting if you could use some data like the NLSY that allows you to sort of follow children in addition to parents to look at future outcomes, not just the current one. That would be yet another insightful thing. Thank you so much, and looking forward to more discussion for what's working.
Okay, thank you very much, Claudia. We're just about out of time. Tim, would you like to take a moment to respond and take us out?
Well, yeah, Claudia, thank you very much for your comments. And yeah, if you can send me a copy of the slides, I'll do it. Maybe we can talk about some more sometime. I mean, a brief response to the one point, and maybe this won't make any sense to anyone else, but the reason why I think of this as industry and then industry occupation matrices, I kind of very much think of the industry thing as a specific model of how export-based industries demand is determined, combined with technology changing due to the industry occupation matrix change at national level. One, there's a second reason for doing it this way. I think you get more precise estimates, whereas if you wanted to use baseline occupational shares, for example, you'd have much more imprecision in measuring them in the baseline, as well as imprecision in measuring demand for them over time. So I think you can do a lot more. The industry stuff comes from establishment data, and you can do a lot more. You have more precise estimates. So I think there were both econometric reasons of precision, as well as some modeling reasons of how you want to think about how occupational demand changes that argue for this approach. But that's kind of very brief. We would need to discuss this some more to really explain what I'm getting at here.
Yeah, I think we're actually out of time. So I want to thank everybody. It's really been really fascinating. And thanks for people who attended as well. And thanks to Discussants. And this is a great topic. So I'm glad to see everyone focused on it because it's so important. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, David, for sharing.